Bright Tuty. Every student matters.
Hello dear students, welcome to another lecture. In this class, we are going to begin with chapter 8 of class 11th literature reader Nagaland 4, which is titled A Hunger for Books. Now, as you can see, this written by Doris Lessing is basically an excerpt from her speech that she delivered while receiving the Nobel Prize in Literature in the year 2007. So Doris Lessing was the oldest person to have received the Nobel Prize. She was a British novelist, she was a playwright, and in this chapter that we shall be reading, we are going to read about how crazy she was for books. What was the importance of books in her life, and that is why the name is The Hunger for Books. You know, we are hungry for something that we like, so she loved the books, and that is why obviously she ended up receiving the Nobel Prize for herself. So we shall read her acceptance speech, a part of her acceptance speech, and how she believes that a book is indeed a man's best friend. So she says that I am standing in a doorway, looking through clouds of glowing dust, so to where I am told there is still uncut forest. So she tells us about how she once, she found herself standing in a doorway, in the middle of a door, and she's looking out of that door. She sees clouds which are blowing dust, and she was told that the area where she is looking towards was a part of the forest which was still uncut. Now, still uncut, obviously that means we all know that because of the increasing civilization and urbanization, the forests are being cut frequently on a regular basis. So she says that I am standing at a place where I can see the forest which is still uncut. Yesterday I drove through miles of stumps and charred remains of fires. There, in 1956, there was the most wonderful forest I ever have seen. All now destroyed. People have to eat, they have to get fuel for fire. So she says that yesterday she got a chance to walk through an area which was a mile long, and it was only made of stumps. The stunted woods were kept there. Charred remains of the fires. Charred means the burned and the black. When something is burned, obviously it changes to black in color. So the black and the dark remains of the forest fire were there. And in the year 1956, now she's comparing the present to the past. So present, where there is forest which is burnt, there's only a limited part of the earth which is still covered with forest. In the year 1976, there was the most wonderful forest in that part of the land. But now everything is destroyed. She says that I don't blame people, because after all, people have to eat. So they need to cut forest, they need to sell the wood, they need to get fuel for the fires also, and that is why they cut wood. This is northwest Zimbabwe, early in 80s, and I am visiting a friend who is a teacher in a school in London. He is here to help Africa, as we put it. He is a gently idealistic soul, and what he found in this school shocked him into a depression, from which it was hard to recover. This school is like every other built after independence. It consists of 4 large brick rooms side by side, put straight into the dust, 1, 2, 3, 4, with a half room at one end, which is the library. In these classrooms are blackboards, but my friend keeps the chalks in his pockets, as otherwise they would be stolen. There is no atlas or globe in the school, no textbooks, no exercise books or biros. So she tells us that she now talks about the condition of Northwest Zimbabwe in the early 80s. Okay. So she says that I wish to tell you something about Zimbabwe in the year 80s. Okay. Now she says that I visited a friend of mine who was a teacher in London, and he had come to Zimbabwe to help Africa. So in those days, these Britishers, these whites, they believed that the Africans, the black people, they being underdeveloped and impoverished, they needed the help and support of the Americans. She tells us that her friend visited Zimbabwe with a hope to help the nation progress a bit. He was a very idealistic soul. Idealistic, somebody who's very high on principles, somebody who's looked up to by a lot of people. So he was an idealistic soul, and when he found the kind of school that he had to teach in, he was into depression. And that depression, that shock was so hard, it was so bad that it was very hard for him to recover, to come out of that depression. Now the school was built after independence, in which this man was posted. It had 4 large brick rooms which were made side by side, but they were put straight into dust. There was nothing inside those rooms but dust. That means they were unused. That is why it was dusty. There were 1, 2, 3 and 4. So 4 rooms were there, and half a room at one end, which was the library. Now in these classrooms were blackboards, but the writer tells us, Doris Lessing tells us, that her friend would keep the chalks in his pocket, otherwise the chalks were to be stolen by the kids. There was no atlas, there was no globe in the school, there were no textbooks, no exercise books, no biros. Biros means the ball pens. There were no pens, some things which are very common to find in a school, so everything was missing. As I sit with my friend in his room, people shyly drop in and everyone begs for books. People say, please send us books when you get back to London. One man says, they taught us to read, but we have no books. Everybody I meet, everyone begged for books. So Doris Lessing says that when she was sitting with this friend of hers in his room inside the school, people would come to him shyly. They were a little shy and awkward. They would come, and everybody requested her friend only for one thing, and that was books. Everybody who came, they said to him that you people, that is the people from London, the whites, the Britishers, they have taught us how to read, but we have no books. So they literally begged this friend of the writer to send them books when he went to London. Another idealist teacher from England was rather ill after seeing what the school was like. So there was another teacher who was very idealist, as I have already told you. So he was very idealist, who always believed in very high, unattainable principles. He was from England. So he also, when saw the condition of the school that the writer is talking about, he was very ill. Rather ill means he felt very bad, upset and disappointed, because he never thought that a school would be like this. The reason why school is put in the single inverted commas is because he never thought that this is how the schools were to be. Not long ago, a friend in Zimbabwe told me about a village where the people had not eaten for 3 days, but they were still talking about books and how to get them, about education. So she says that not long ago, there was a friend of hers in Zimbabwe who told her about a village in Zimbabwe where there were people who did not get food to eat for 3 days. So they were hungry for 3 days, but the only thing that they were still talking about was to get food, to be educated. So this is what the people wanted more than food. So the writer further continues. She says, I belong to an organization which started out with the intention of getting books into the villages. There was a group of people who, in other connection, had traveled Zimbabwe at its grassroots. They told me that the villages, unlike what is reported, are full of intelligent people. Teachers retired, teachers on leave, children on holidays, old people. I myself paid for a little survey to discover what people in Zimbabwe wanted to read and found the results were the same as those of a Swedish survey I had not known about. So the writer tells us that she belongs to an organization, and this organization began with an intention, with a wish, with a desire of giving books in the villages. Now, there were a group of people in her organization who actually traveled to Zimbabwe at its grassroots. At its grassroots means they did not observe or look at how the condition of Zimbabwe was superficially, but deep inside the villages, what is all that the people were going through, what is all that the people were bearing. So this is what at grassroots means. Now all these people, when they came back, they told our writer that the villagers are full of intelligent people. It has people who are teachers who were retired, teachers who were on leave, there were kids who were on holidays, then there were old people. So every kind of person could be found in these villages. The writer tells us that she herself paid a visit to Zimbabwe in order to confirm that. But her observation was also equal or was also same as what that Swedish survey had told her. So Swedish, there was a survey done by the Swedish authorities and they also reported the same thing. That although these people do not have books, but they are, inhabited by people who were intelligent and were teachers and could actually impart education. She says people want to read the same kind of books that people in Europe want to read. Novels of all kinds, science fiction, poetry, detective stories, plays and do-it-yourself books, like how to open a bank account. All of Shakespeare too. A problem with finding books for villagers is that they don't know what is available. So a set book like The Mayor of Casterbridge becomes popular simply because it just happens to be there. Animal Farm, for obvious reasons, is the most popular of all the novels. So she says that people in these villages of Zimbabwe, they wanted to read the same kind of books that the people in Europe want to read. Be it novels, be it science fiction, be it poetry, detective, plays, DIY books, everything. So they wanted to read exactly what the Europeans were reading. They were even interested in reading Shakespeare. Now the problem with finding the books was that they don't know what is available. So the villagers were not aware of what was available around them, and so a book called The Mayor of Casterbridge became very, very popular in that village in that time because that was the only book that was available in the village. Also, apart from The Mayor of Casterbridge, there was another book, Animal Farm, which became very famous because of its theme. It was related to animals, so it became very famous again. And because of the writer of Animal Farm as well. Our organization was helped from the very start by Norway and then by Sweden. Without this kind of support, our supplies of books would have dried up. So the writer says that when she started this organization of hers, which aimed at providing books to the people in villages of Zimbabwe, she was supported by Norway and Sweden because unless they would have helped her, their supply of books would have dried up. It would have soon finished. Alone, they could not have managed to, arrange for the books for such a huge group of people. We got books from everywhere we could. Remember, a good paperback from England costs a month's wages in Zimbabwe. That was before Mugabe's reign of terror. Now, with inflation, it would cost several years' wages. But having taken a box of books out to a village and remember there is a terrible shortage of petrol, I can tell you that the box was greeted with tears. The library may be a plank on bricks under a tree, and within a week there will be literacy classes. People who can read teaching those who can't. Citizenship classes, and in one remote village, since there were no novels written in the Tonga language, a couple of lads sat down to write novels in Tonga. She says that we got books from wherever we could, and she also tells us that she's talking about that time when in England paperback editions had become very famous. Now the paperback are basically the cheaper versions of the original novels written by the novelists, by the writers. The reason why they are called paperback is because they are presumably affordable by all. They are cheaper as compared to the original. So where on one hand the same novels which were paperback in England, which were considered to be cheap and affordable in England, in Zimbabwe, if a person had to buy the same novel, he had to forego a month's wages. That means that a person actually had to save his or her salaries for a lot of months before they could save and buy a paperback edition, which was considered to be so cheap in England. That was before the rule of Mugabe, the ruler there. After the reign, because of the inflation means the price rise. So because of the rise in price now, there have been such a huge increase in the price that earlier where the person had to save months' salaries to buy one book, now a person was forced to save years' salaries to buy the same book. This is how much these people were suffering. But she says that we took a box full of books to that village, a village where there was terrible shortage of petrol. We don't know how we managed to travel to that village because there was shortage of petrol. When we went there, the books were greeted with tears. The people of that village got so happy, were so overwhelmed and emotional that they started crying on the books. Within a week, they started the literacy classes, classes wherein they were going to impart education. The people who could read were going to teach those who couldn't. Although their library was beneath a tree on a plank, a wooden, plank, a piece of wood was their library. But just seeing the books, these people became so happy that they started crying, and then there were two gentlemen, lads. Lads means gentlemen, young boys. It is said that a people gets the government it deserves, but I do not think it is true of Zimbabwe. And we must remember that this respect and hunger for books comes not from Mugabe's regime, but from the one before it, the whites. It is an astonishing phenomenon, this hunger of books, and it can be seen everywhere from Kenya down to the Cape of Good Hope. So, the writer tells us that it is said that the people get the kind of government that they deserve. But that is surely not true with Zimbabwe, because going by the hunger and the desire they had to read books, They did not have the government that they needed. She says that it is not that it is because of the Mugabe's regime, it is because of the rule that Mugabe had that the people started craving for books and they developed such a hunger for books. But it was from the rule of whites. This is something that the people in Zimbabwe have inculcated from the state, from the duration when the whites were there in their country. And this hunger for books can be seen everywhere, from Kenya to the Cape of Good Hope. I have been looking at the speeches by some of the recent Nobel Prize winners. Take last year's winner, the magnificent Orhan Pamuk. He said his father had 500 books. His talent did not come out of the air. He was connected with the great tradition. So she further tells us that she has been reading, obviously in order to prepare for her speech on receiving the Nobel Prize, she had been preparing for it and she read the speeches delivered by the earlier Nobel Prize winners, and one of them was Pamuk. And she says that I read how that man had written that his father had 500 books. So this talent that the Nobel Prize winner inherited was not something that came to him out of the thin air. He had inherited that. He was connected to it because he was the son to a father who had 500 books with him. So we can imagine what legacy he was following. Take V.S. Naipaul. He mentions that the Indian Vedas were close behind the memory of his family. His father encouraged him to write, and when he got to England, he would visit the British Library. So he would close to the great tradition. She also talks about V.S. Naipaul. She tells us that V.S. Naipaul would mention that he always thought of Indian Vedas because this is something that his family had always taught. So it was his father who encouraged him to write, and when he went to England, he would visit the British Library and he would sit there and he felt himself to be very close to the great tradition, the Vedas. Let us take John Coetzee. He was not only close to the great tradition, he was the tradition. He taught literature in Cape Town, and how sorry I am that I was never in one of his classes, taught by the wonderfully brave boy. She says, let us take another example, John Coetzee. Now, these are all the Nobel Prize winners that she's talking about. So she says, let us talk about John Coetzee. He was not only close to the tradition of reading and writing, but he himself was the tradition, because he taught literature in Cape Town. And the writer says that at times I feel very sorry, I regret that why was I not a part of his students? Why did I not attend his classes? The teacher who was so wonderfully brave and bold. In order to write, in order to make literature, there must be a close connection with libraries, books and the tradition. She says that if one wants to write, one has to be very closely connected to libraries, to books and to one's traditions, to one's roots. I have a friend from Zimbabwe, a black writer. He taught himself to read from the labels on jam jars, the labels on preserved fruit cans. He was brought up in an area I have driven through, an area for rural blacks. The earth is grit and gravel. There are no sparse bushes. The huts are poor, nothing like the well cared for huts of the better off. There was a school, but like the one I have described. So she further tells us that she has a friend from Zimbabwe who is a black writer. And he taught himself how to read and write from the labels that one could see on the jam jars, the jar of the jam, or the other fruit cans. Whatever was written on them, that is how he learned how to read and write. He grew up in an area which she says that I have driven through that area. I have been through that area myself, and that is an area which is rural. It is not at all urban, it is not at all developed, forget about developing, and it is inhabited by blacks. She further tells us that the earth is grit and gravel. Grit means pieces of stone and sand. So the entire earth is made up of pieces of stones, of sand, of rocks, and there are low sparse bushes which are spread all across. The huts that she came across in that area, they were poor. These huts did not seem to be like those well-cared huts, that belonged to people who were better off. And there was a school, but like the one she has described. So, the kind of school that she had described, she came across a similar school in that part of Zimbabwe as well. He found a discarded children's encyclopedia on a rubbish heap and taught himself from that. Discarded means something which is thrown, something which is unused, something which is supposed to be a waste by somebody. So he saw that in that school there was a children's encyclopedia which somebody had discarded, had thrown away. And it is from that encyclopedia that he taught himself, that he learned from himself. All the writers traveled a difficult road to literacy, let alone to becoming writers. I would say learning to read from the printed labels on jam jars and discarded encyclopedias was not uncommon. And we are talking about people hungering for standards of education beyond them, living in huts with many children, an overworked mother, a fight for food and clothing. So she says that all the writers that she has seen achieving such great heights, they have actually traveled a very difficult road to literacy. That is, it was very difficult for them to educate themselves, let alone becoming writers. So, becoming writers is something which is well beyond. But just being educated in the first place was very difficult. She says that if we consider, reading from or learning how to read and write from the jam jars or from the encyclopedias which were wasted, all these examples are very uncommon in nature. You will not come across people who have such a hunger to learn and hunger to read. And she says that we are talking about people over here who wanted to get education which was beyond them. They knew it was not possible for them to get educated, but they still wanted it. It was beyond them, but they wanted that. They lived in huts with many children. Earlier they were in such impoverished areas that they were living in small huts which had a lot of children in it. They were living with their mothers who were always overworked, and they would always fight for food and clothing. And despite that, they managed to get themselves educated and become writers. Yet, despite these difficulties, writers came into being. And we should always remember that this was Zimbabwe, conquered 100 years before. The grandparents of these people might have been storytellers working in the oral tradition. In 1 or 2 generations, the transition was made from these stories, remembered and passed on to printed books. So she says that despite all these difficulties that these writers faced, they came into being. They came into being means they managed to carve themselves a niche. They managed to achieve something in their lives. And she says that we are talking over here about Zimbabwe, a part of land, a piece of land or a country which was conquered 100 years before, so which came into being 100 years before. In that time, the grandparents would actually narrate to their kids the stories that were in the oral tradition. So orally, the grandparents would tell their kids the stories, that would share with each other their experiences, their stories. And then in 1 or 2 generations, a transition was made. There was a shift that could be seen. The stories, they passed on to print and then to books. So the stories changed to the printed forms, from oral to printed forms. This was the transition, this was the change that one could see over these years. Books were literally wrested from rubbish heaps and the detritus of a white man's world. But a sheaf of paper is one thing. So a sheaf of paper is one thing. A published book, quite another. Yes, so she says that I have never had several accounts sent to me of the publishing scene in Africa. Even in more privileged places like North Africa, to talk of a publishing scene in a dream of possibilities. So she says that books at that time, the time that she's telling us about, were literally wrested from rubbish heaps. Wrested means they were pulled out. They were taken out of rubbish. People had thrown the books around like dung. And these books were taken out of those heaps. And the detritus of the white man's world. Detritus means the natural waste material which is left after somebody leaves. So whose leaving is being talked about over here? The white man. So she says that people in those areas, in those times, they got their books from the rubbish or from whatever remained after the white man, after the Britishers had left. But a sheaf of paper is one thing. Sheaf means basically, a bundle of papers. Anything which is written. If, I have 100 papers around me on which 100 different things are written. I pick them up, I staple them, that becomes a sheaf of paper. So reading something like this, which is totally, nonsensical, which has got no logic behind it, there is no aim or objective behind it, is one thing. But a published book is something which is altogether a different phenomenon. She says that I have several accounts, I have several stories which were sent to me of how the publishing began in Africa. Even in the more privileged places like North Africa, to talk of a publishing scene is a dream of possibilities. So not only the villages or the rural Africa, but even the privileged Africa, if we talk about, publishing was something that actually took a lot of time. So my dear students, I'm going to pause here. We learned about how the writer describes to us the hunger for books that the people had, that made them learn and grow and progress in life.